Buenos días, ya casi.
Hello again. Good afternoon to all of you. And we are on the second day of our events. Our doctoral seminar, Carlos V European Awards, Cultural Roads of the Council of Europe, Culture, Heritage, History and Memory for the Promotion of European Values, Integration and Peace. Today's session is being very interesting, and now we have the presentation by María Rodríguez Alcázar. She will speak about understanding the dynamics of the culture of citizens' participation in regional organizations under the treaties, the jure historical approach. For that, and to introduce her, we have TERESA FREIXES SANJUÁN. She is the co-director of this seminar. She's the chair of constitutional law and the president of the European Academy of Doctors. She is holds many other positions.
Importantes tratados como el Tratado de Ámsterdam o como la Carta de Derechos.
She's participated in the European Constitution Project, the Lisbon Treaty. She has directed the national focal point of the fundamental rights of the EU and the European Institute for Gender Equality, and she is a very active person in civil society. She has presided the patronate of free culture, Citizens Pro Europe, and we collaborate with her. And she is also at the Hermes Institute on Digital Citizenship, and she is also someone who is very engaged with the European project from the point of view of civil society, especially as a professional jurist. We have been lucky to have her involved directly in drafting fundamental texts for Europe. She has a living experience in the European building process. She is a great reference for us, and it's a great honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours to introduce the next speaker.
Sí, vale, ya está. Pues muchas gracias. Se nota que
Thank you very much. I can tell that's very much loved here, and it's a great honor for me to collaborate with you and be a part of such an interesting seminar, both at a personal and professional level. Now we are going to listen to the presentation by María Rodríguez Alcázar. She's going to speak about a very hot topic on the civil society. She's going to tell us how the citizens' organizations are getting involved in building the what she calls the regional organizations. We're going to hear her presentation before we move on to the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your presentation, Teresa.
English, and yeah, oh, I see the excitement. That's great. That's great. So yeah, first of all, thank you, the Yuste Foundation, for this opportunity of being here today and being during these days with my colleagues that are wonderful, but also for being in this impressive audience, also with professors that will enrich our research. And I'm especially honored, actually, that Teresa is chairing this discussion, because I consider her actually a living history of the subject of my research. And I really admire her commitment, both in the academic side, but also in the personal side, as you mentioned before, Miguel, in the living practice of the regional organizations. In my case, what I'm researching and what I will be presenting today is this research focus on understanding the evolution of citizen participation in regional organizations. Someone asked me, like, regional organizations as in what? Like, what does it mean? Is in which level, right? In which geographical level? So I will focus on international organizations, so international regional organizations, meaning those international organizations that are composed by countries that are in the same regional area, in the same geographical area, okay? But we are talking about international organizations. And in my research, I will focus on perspectives from the founding treaties. So we will be talking mainly about founding treaties. I will explain this later. But in any case, my research, this part is framed in my PhD that is about the contribution of citizens to regional organizations, more focused actually on the positive contribution for the effectiveness of regional organizations. And I researched at the Ghent University, but also at the United Nations University Institute that focuses on comparative regional integration studies. So regional integration and regional organizations are very much into the core of what we do there. Let me just walk you through my research, and first of all, this is my research question, what I will try to picture today here for you, and it's how have citizen participation mechanisms evolved in regional organizations across the world. And actually this part of across the world will be also fundamental. So first of all, I mean, I really care about this topic. I'm very enthusiastic about regional organizations, also about citizen participation. You saw me before even asking the question, but why should you care about this? So first, if we look at the studies of citizen participation across the world, we see that most of the literature has focused on the national level. So when we try to study this at the international level, it's true that we are not finding so much. But the literature is quite rich, actually, at the national level, especially if we look at public administration theory. So what we see is that several researchers can verify that citizen participation actually enhances the implementation of policy. This means because the citizens actually, they get closer to the implementation, they care more about the particular policies that are being developed, or because they are asking for more follow-up of those decisions that are made by governments. But also, what is shown in the literature is that the citizen participation, so the engagement of citizens, is a promoter of effective governments and public services. So that means that, according to these studies that I'm quoting there, that there is a further interest from the administrations to understand which are the needs of the citizens and their interest in order to produce regulation. But not only that, so it's not only the effective, so it's not only about the policy going to the core of the interest, it's also about the efficiency, about using the resources like in the minimal amount that we need to actually give response to the needs of the citizens. So this is what the literature is actually about in this field. So showing or showcasing the benefits of citizen participation in national but also local governments. And what is seen as well is that governments that try to include citizens and try to engage citizens, they are more likely to be transparent, to be accountable, and in a way that also creates the spillover effect or the feedback effect that increases the legitimacy and the reliability of those governments. And this is important, especially when we play in the international field, because you want to be seen as a reliable partner for the different partners, the different member states that you are also working with. So with this, I jump to the international level. I said that it's not super huge or wide literature, but there are already some things studied. We can see that in this level, we mainly focus on the global governance theories, so all the theories around global governance, that they show citizen participation and citizen engagement as a key factor for good governance. And good governance is actually one of the main worries of international organizations at the moment, or at least in the last decade. It's been very present in the agenda. But further than this, also the engagement of citizens is strengthening the democratic processes, and it's seen as a complement for representative democracy. So it's seen as a way of giving citizens the voice that sometimes they don't feel they have, because of the decisions being made just by representatives of the governments at the international level. So it's seen in a way that at the international level, at the global level even, there is a lack of accountability, there is a lack of democracy, there is a lack of the citizen actually present in the decision making. So actually this engagement and these new mechanisms, let's see how new in a bit, they are trying to counter this lack of accountability. And this is actually something that Holte presents very well, that this engagement of citizens can actually revert many logics that are against international organizations, or, you know, this lack of, or this feeling that the citizenship. So, in the last decade, as I mentioned, there is a growing interest for international organizations to actually be more open to different stakeholders and creating different bodies, different mechanisms to actually engage them in their day-to-day. There are several studies on this. I'm just going through that in a bit. But then why we are doing this study? So we have seen that it's not widely studied yet how international organizations are involving citizens, but also what we see is that most of the studies that are existing are first qualitative, and they focus on one or two international organizations. I mean, this is natural. It's the nature also of qualitative research. You cannot just do like big studies with so many regional organizations or international organizations. So this doesn't allow us to have a systematic view of what's happening in the world with the different mechanisms to engage citizens. So that's for the first part. So most of the literature, focus only on a couple of regional organizations. But then in those studies that we have that are quantitative, there is a strong bias only for big international organizations. And this is also quite deeply studied by Sommermann and Thalberg. They try to create actually databases that are a bit more focused on small regional organizations, meaning those organizations that are only composed by 2, 3, 4 member states, but not like 150, let's say. So it's true that there are not so many resources to study these smaller international organizations, but now actually kind of recently in 2016, we had new resources, and that's actually what is allowing this research to happen. So once more, what we will focus here today is on how have citizen participation mechanisms evolved in regional organizations, so in this kind of international organizations across the world, so in a systematic way. So then first, I skipped this at the beginning, but maybe let's describe a bit more what citizen participation means. I'm actually using the definition by Baum that actually says that citizens is not only the individuals, so us as people, but also it can be organized communities. So in this case, we can think about civil society organizations, for example. We can think about the private sector. We can think about collective of people, so not just individuals as we are. So in this research, we operationalize this in first, citizens as individuals, but also citizens as non-state actors. Later on, we will give a bit more details, but let's say non-state actors for the moment. And participation, it's the engagement of those citizens that can range between observation and exercising power. There are different theories about this. You may be familiar with the ladder of participation developed by Einstein, but also like now in the recent years, there is so much developed in the field of international organizations, for example, by the OECD, that there are different steps in which citizens or different stakeholders can engage in international organizations. So yeah, let's say this engagement of citizens is what we understand as participation. But then in this research, we will make a contrast, let's say, between de jure and de facto. This means like what is actually regulated, which are the mechanisms that are agreed, like more in an institutional setting, which is like the different agreements, regulations that the international organizations or regional organizations have. And then we contrast that with the practice, what's actually taking place. It's not the same to agree to have a mechanism to have elections in your regional organizations or to actually develop elections like every 5 years, let's say. So we are also looking at this difference. It's true that first, only looking at the regulation doesn't give us the full picture, because of course, I mean, we need to contrast if we want to analyze reality, but we shouldn't also underestimate what the treaties can also tell us, no? Because the treaties are in a way enabling the work of the organization, and it's true that for some reasons, like there are so many limitations, we cannot go as deep as we would like to in these de facto mechanisms for citizen participation. So what we will use for this research first is this new data set. Well, it was produced in 2016, so it's already quite some years, but it's the Comparative Regional Organizations Project. And it's a huge data set that actually contains information from the founding treaties of, I would say, all the regional organizations in the world from 1945 to 2016. So actually it allows for comparisons across many decades. And it includes information about 75 current regional organizations, but also those predecessors of them. So for example, if we are talking about the current African Union, before it was the Organization of the African Unity. So we have information about, like, since the beginning of the Organization of the African Community until now with the African Union. Same thing with the European Union with the different names and many other organizations in the world. Which actually, again, it allows us to have this longitudinal study. And what is great, actually, is that this database includes information for more than 100 characteristics of regional organizations. So we have information about the organs that they have, but also the values that they try to project. Also, which are the, like different mechanisms to, in this case, engage with civil society, but many others. Probably if you have something in mind, is also considered there. And there is, in particular, one section about representation of interest that is actually the main data set, like the main variables that we will be using. I must say that when using the data set, when you get the data set, you never use just that. You need to make like a lot of verifications on the process, and you need to check many things. And that was the case for this data set as well. So for some variables, actually, there are many changes. So the sample that we use is a bit changed from the original. I can further elaborate on this if you are interested in. And we also reduced a bit the sample because there are some regional organizations that were actually transcontinental regional organizations that have some peculiarities in the way they work. So we actually just reduced the sample to those regional organizations that are from the same continent. Okay, so composed by member states from the same continent. So we had some limitations, of course, as I mentioned before. So now we have 238 treaties, so funding treaties and amendments, so amending treaties to those funding treaties. But it's true that this doesn't show like all the de jure regulation of those regional organizations, because we are missing here the further protocols, other administrative agreements, other rules of procedure that they may develop. So let's say these lower scope agreements. And honestly, this is something that we cannot overcome, because there is no data set that we can use for this at the moment. But I mean, while we are offering with this, with this data set, we are seeing just the jure perspective, so the regulation. What we try to do, and what we did actually with this research, is collecting data. So we collected information about how de facto, so in practice, those mechanisms that we saw that should be implemented are implemented or not. So we actually checked if in practice that's happening. So that's the de facto part that I will explain in a bit. So for you to understand the framework of the analysis and like the different steps that we followed, so first we went to this de jure perspective. So first we looked at those regional organizations that have explicit mention to civil participation, and don't take civil participation as the exact terms that we used all the times, because we understand also like that doing research that tries to be applicable for the whole world, probably not in all the continents, they are using exactly the same wording. So we understood civil participation, also citizen participation, citizen engagement, you know, some sort of engagement that is clearly stated. We have also the list of concrete words that we used for the analysis. So that's the first part. Then, the second step was looking at those organizations that were committing to offering access for information related to their meetings, so related to decision making. In this case, in particular, we focus on the access to meetings, so access to deliberations, but also access to the minutes of those meetings, so the agreements after the meetings of the parliament or the meetings of the commission, for example. Why we do this? Because in all these theories of participation, of engagement of citizens, we see that the first step for participation is actually having access to information. So without that access of participation, we understand that other steps can actually not exist. So we analyze this, and then the third step is looking straight to those mechanisms for direct participation of citizens. We took two main mechanisms that are first elections, so elections for any regional organization organ, but also we look at something that is not that occasional, that is more sustained in time, that is the engagement of non-state actors, in particular NGOs and profit-oriented actors. Then we also look at other mechanisms, but honestly you will see in the results that this is not really significant. Then when moving at de facto, so if you see the difference also like in the colors, de facto, we had to reduce a bit more like the analysis, because we couldn't like look for the evidences of all of them. It was a quite intense exercise to actually collect the data. So we focused only on checking those organizations that committed to provide access to information, whether they were doing it or not, and also those organizations that were committed to develop elections for any organs, whether they were developing elections in practice or not. So that's about it. Are you ready for the results of the analysis? I got you? Okay, great. So knowing that you are following me, there we can go. So this is just for you to have the picture of our sample in a way. So you can see that divided per regions, which are the organizations that are including any provision of citizen participation. I'm not making any difference on what exactly right now. So you can see, like in some first conclusions, that The numbers of regional organizations is not really a lot, so it's very limited. In fact, only two-thirds of the treaties that we analyzed, they don't contain any provision on citizen participation. So two-thirds of the treaties, they are not mentioning civil participation at all. So that means only one-third is actually mentioning citizen participation, so just for the start. Then only 40 regional organizations. So just let me comment, because I didn't explain before that we have, for one regional organization, we have several treaties. Because imagine, for example, the European Union, we have the treaty in 51 or 57, and so all across the years. So that's why we have many more treaties than regional organizations. So only 40 regional organizations actually include provisions for citizen participation. And of those 40, only 15 mention explicitly that in the founding treaty. So that means that they are not calling it citizen participation, but they are including provisions without calling it that way. In 4 cases, actually, there are a couple of organizations that they don't include any provision, but they say they do. And those are the cases that, well, we would also like to study more in depth in a qualitative way. So then, if we come back to the original graph, we have limited number of regional organizations. We can see also that the pioneers of this, of including provisions for citizen participation, were around the 80s, so in 1980s. But then in 1990, we see an expansion of that. So we see that that's growing around the 2000s. And we can see also some regional dynamics. So it's, as you can see, it's not the same logic like in all the regions in the world. We can see that in Europe, in America, that actually is more Latin America, because the sample for the US and Canada is really small. And also in Africa, it's quite okay. But then if we look at Asia-Pacific or Eurasia, we can see that the organizations that are included in any provisions are not that represented in the picture. Then moving to our first analysis, so the explicit mention to civil participation. And I only included the first time that they actually mentioned that. We can see that the Andean community, so actually more in Latin America, is the first one that includes that. I don't know if you can see really the graph from your seat, but so it's, so it's this one. In 1979, actually, that the Andean community included this for the first time. If you remember, in comparison with the previous graph, the first time that civil participation is mentioned in the treaties is after their mechanisms developed. So this happens in 1980s, and then the first mechanisms were actually implemented in 45, let's say. So I think this is important to know that the actual use of the term comes after using the practices, or at least including them in the treaties. Then we can see also something curious when looking at this graph. I saw that around the 2000, there is something happening. So I mean, there is like a gap there. There is like kind of 2 periods. And this is something that we will continue seeing in the next graph that I will show in a bit for different variables. So this already announces that maybe there is something there that we should further research. I'm not going to go in detail through this, but maybe you are interested, because there are some regional organizations that they actually give the justification, the why they are including civil participation. And for me, it was very curious that actually, well, there is one particular part that I really like, that is this one about the, the general vision of participation as a prerequisite for the success of the regional organization. And we can see that in the Americas is actually quite high. But I must say that this is not really representative for all the regions, because, for example, in Europe, we only have one sample of one organization, that is the European Union, that gives a justification. But if you are interested in any case for the Americas or for Africa, I think we can talk about that, because, yeah, in there, these numbers make more sense. So then, coming back to the analysis, let's go to the second step, the provisions for access to information. So in this, we focus on the access to meetings and minutes, as I mentioned before. And again, we can see something, again, it's not super clear, but it's something around 1995, 2000. So it's not clear, but it seems that something is happening there, and we should look for an explanation for that in the future, and I think that will be a follow-up of this research. Looking at the organizations more in particular, and also at the organs, usually it's the parliamentary organ, so the parliament, that is the one that is committed to offer the information to citizens, which makes sense, actually, because it's also the organ that is meant to represent the citizens. And then after that, we can see like more the commission or the council. So this kind of inter-estatal organ, or more the executive power of the regional organization. We went, as I mentioned, to checking, like, okay, those organizations that said that they would commit to this, are they actually offering this information? And to operationalize this, to put it like in a practical way, so for the public access to meetings and deliberations, what we looked is whether they were offering the agenda of the meeting publicly, and also we included if they were offering access to live stream. And I put it like into brackets because I understand that we cannot check this really for all the regional organizations. This is something quite new in most of them, so we also need to treat it as, again, something new. But I think it was interesting to see what was the result. Then for the public access to minutes and protocols, that it was the data set that I was using used as a formulation, what I checked, is whether we had access to the minutes after the meeting. What we can see, I can put them by organs, but maybe we can also comment a bit about the regions. For most of them, we didn't find information, so those cells that are in blank, it's that we didn't find any information whatsoever. So we cannot confirm one thing or the other. For those that you can find the cross that are still like in green, there was no information, and we know that there is no information because there should be there, and it was not. For those that are in blue, indeed we found the information. You can see that the European Union is quite well present there, also the Council of Europe, and mostly some European organizations. It's not that the case as much with the African regional organizations, but still we can find a bit here and there. Oh, I don't know if I did something or it was something. Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, that's a bit the picture that we get with this. Then, moving on to our third, I cannot use this anymore. Well, I can explain in any case, like what's gonna come. That is, yeah, okay, great. Perfect, thank you. So we are moving to the part on the elections at some point. So for the elections, what we checked actually is those regional organizations that have committed to they have provisions to develop direct elections. So meaning the citizens would actually vote for representatives in any organ. What we saw is that organ in regional organizations is only the parliament. So there is no regional organizations that they commit to elect the commission or they commit to elect anything else. We can discuss that with the European Commission, with the Spitzenkandidat and all this, but yeah. So what we analyzed was first, if they commit to develop direct elections, but also we checked whether they have any mechanisms for indirect elections. So meaning that the national parliaments that they already vote are electing the representatives for the regional parliament. And we do this because it's often used as a transitionary measure in many regional organizations. So this is a bit the map that we have. You can see that the regional organizations, they are mentioned like several times. So for example, the European Union, that was the first including in the treaties direct elections for the European Parliament. It was a bit back and forth in the treaties saying whether it was direct only or that there would be a transitionary measure as it happened there, as you can see in the first mention. But then there was also a development like around 1990. As you can see, there was like an explosion of these kind of elections. So that's something that we can, again, see. Looking directly, like here's really the summary in case you are interested. I don't know if you can really see, but you will see that in the final paper. In bold, you can see the final treaty. Okay, so the up-to-date treaty. So we can see that there are some organizations that actually they committed to develop direct elections. Some of them, for example, I think it's very curious, the case of CAN, that is the Andean community, that they committed to have direct elections, but then in the next regulation they said, no, we will have indirect elections, but then actually when we check in practice, because we also did this contrast, we can see that in the case of CAN, that is in the middle of the table, they actually didn't commit in their final treaty to have it because they still had like the transitionary provision, but they actually in practice developed direct elections. What we can see in practice is, starting by the bottom of the chart, is that the European Union, as you know, developed elections since 1979, if I don't remember wrongly, and it's very curious, the case of the European Union, because the elections happen simultaneously, and it's something that maybe we take for granted, but that's not the case in all the regions in the world. They happen simultaneously in all the countries, in all the member states, and they adapt actually to the electoral system or to the rules and the traditions of the different member states. And this is curious because, for example, there is like this voting. You know that it's not only one day for voting, but they adapt because there are also different countries that vote in different days or these things. Now there is a lot of discussion actually after the conference on the future of Europe on changing that, but okay, that's an open discussion. Then if we look at, again, like Asia-Pacific and Eurasia, they don't develop these mechanisms, so they are not represented here. Looking at Africa, the two organizations that committed to this are actually not delivering yet the actual fact of electing the representatives. So we have CEMAC and UEMOA. So for those two, we didn't find any evidence on these elections. And then for the case of the Americas, and this is actually where I get like super enthusiastic because I think there are very interesting facts here. For the case of Parlacen and CAN, they are very similar, even in their regulations. So for both of them, they develop elections in all the countries, but they are not simultaneous. So that means that whenever, let's say, Guatemala is developing their national elections, they also have the possibility of voting for the regional members of the parliament. So they develop the elections whenever their national elections are taking place. Same happens, as I mentioned, in CAN, that originally, like the final treaty does not say that they would have direct elections. But the case of Mercosur is actually very curious, because they committed to have, like in 2005, direct elections, and indeed they started developing those elections, but they only happened, like direct elections, so the citizens going to vote, in a couple of countries. So there are Brazil and Uruguay that they didn't develop those direct elections, so they still voted indirectly, so the national parliaments were electing their representatives. And then what happened that was that thing very interesting was that in 2019, they said, okay, this is not working. It's only working for a couple of countries, and we need something that works for the whole regional organization. We are better coming back to the previous system. We are all of us electing the representatives indirectly, so from our national parliament, so the citizens are not voting anymore in those countries that they were voting. And what we will do is developing a system that is simultaneous, so that is happening in all the countries at the same way, at the same time, with the goal that those elections are, again, happening for all of them at the same time in a sort of way as in the European Union. And yeah, so in the meantime, right now, they are coming back to the previous system, which is not always that logical, let's say, when they were already in that path. So yeah, for me, this was really, really curious to see in the findings. So just moving to the last thing that we analyzed, so the last variable, that was, as if you remember, the more sustained participation by non-state actors. We can find well, different organizations in the table. Maybe you don't recognize the acronyms. I'm sorry. It's also difficult to know all of them. And most of them, what we can highlight here actually is that in a different way that in the previous variables that we analyzed, Eurasia and Asia Pacific regional organizations were not present. In here they are. In here we can see ASEAN, for example. We can see the Pacific Community. We can see even the League of Arab States. So it's very curious, and I think this also deserves a quite like a deeper look, let's say, of course, in a more qualitative way. We gave one step more, that was checking whether those regional organizations were were actually institutionalized. So if the regional organization was creating like a body or an advisory council or any mechanism that was like fixed in the treaties to regulate their participation. So as for example, I was thinking on the European Social and Economic Council or some sort of mechanism of this way. And what we see is actually that only a few of regional organizations actually institutionalize the participation of non-governmental actors. Again, it can be NGOs, it can be private sector or profit-oriented. And honestly, my conclusion here is not that they don't develop them, because we know that there are many regional organizations that they actually have those mechanisms. But what we find out is that they are hardly regulated in funded treaties. That is what we are researching. So most probably they are regulated in lower scope treaties. That is what, unfortunately, we cannot research within the scope of this project. And then going to other mechanisms, as I mentioned at the beginning, we can see some complaints to ombudsman, petitions, collective complaints, public consultations. But what we find is that analyzing the funding treaties, we can only find like a couple of organizations, that is basically the European Union, the Council of Europe, the Eurasian Economic Union. And again, I don't think this is really the picture, because I mean, for example, for public consultations, we know that the European Union or Mercosur, they are constantly opening processes of consultations. So again, for me, it's more a conclusion that we cannot study this just looking at the funding treaties, but we really need to look at lower scope agreements. So yeah, I hope this was interesting to see some conclusions. As you see, we can see some logics like that are repeated across the different variables seen. For example, the non-presence of Asia or Eurasia. We can see this thing that is happening around the 2000s, 1990 something, and also this small limitation that we have with the funding treaties. Going to the future steps and things that can come with as a result of this research. I think we have a lot that could be actually discovered if we had access to lower scope treaties. Unfortunately, this is something that we cannot do at the moment because there is no data set. And if you know about something, please let me know because I will very gladly have a look to that. But then what we can do is actually with the different variables that we have, I know that that will sound in a bit, and it's very frightening now. So just in what we can do actually with the information that we have at the moment is developing an index of the jure citizen participation. So meaning that all these different variables that we have, we compose them in one single indicator that can actually allow us to compare the different regions. But also what we can do as well with the information that we have and with a bit more of qualitative research is seeing the influences between the different regions. We saw already that some treaties, they look the same. I mean, when you read them, you can see the same phrasings between regional organizations. What we can do is not only comparing the text, but also comparing when different institutions were created, like if it was, if there is like an influence between the different regions. So that's something that we can do to expand this project. And also, what I find especially interesting is that we can explore also the relationship with other institutional characteristics. In particular, right now with another project that I'm developing, also with the people that develop like the database that I'm using, we are creating some indicators to understand the structure and the scope of regional organizations. For example, measuring which are the competences that the different organs in regional organizations they have, and also creating indicators for this. So we could potentially, with this information that we have now, also understand whether, or explore the hypothesis, whether parliaments that they have more competencies, whether they are developing or not direct elections. If there is a cause in there, because maybe, like, why are you going to develop elections for your parliament if your parliament is actually not relevant for the citizens? So we can explore this kind of hypothesis now, combining with this other project. And then what I found very interesting and we saw as a conclusion in the different analysis is understanding the triggers for citizen participation expansion around the 2000s, let's say 1995. So yeah, I hope this was interesting for you. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much, and I think I will really benefit from the vision from different disciplines that you will have. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, María, por tu...
Thank you, Maria, for your presentation and your work. I think it was really interesting. Even if it's not my working field, I do not do this type of analysis, even if I find them useful to try and understand why things happen, why certain things happen. I'm going to make some remarks. For some qualitative analysis, more than quantitative analysis. The quantitative analysis is very interesting, but maybe I can add some more qualitative analysis, or maybe we can create a context for this participatory work. The discussion will be, why are you including the European Union as a regional organization? That's a concept that is a legal question, because the European Union is a supranational organization, more than international. But, well, I would nuance it by saying that it is not strictly what we would call regional organization. Nevertheless, your approach that participatory democracy is a complement to representative democracy. It bridges some of the gaps that participative democracy has. So when you talk about representative democracy, well, obviously you take into account direct election mechanisms and both direct and indirect mechanisms. But you should take that into account also to understand why each of the organizations you have chosen use that direct participation elections. Is it for lawmaking purposes or for other purposes? Because if it's for lawmaking purposes, of course it's more powerful than just for debates or consultations. There are more mechanisms than direct or indirect elections. Other organizations have paid attention to this, for example, auditions or reports or appearances. I don't know if you have taken that into account, but for future analysis, you have to include all those participatory mechanisms, reporting, appearances, etc. I have the impression that in the database, the Council of Europe is not well represented, but I think that is not your fault. That is the database's fault. But the Council of Europe is a good example of indirect election. The Council of Europe uses many participatory techniques, even if the index you have used needs to take it into account. In this kind of work, maybe you can also signal the source deficit so that in future versions of the source they can amend the deficits. And my final remark is that the conclusions are reached very fast. What is really original and powerful is participation in the European Union, because it's the only parliament that is directly elected by the citizens, and it is for lawmaking purposes, because parliament passes and makes laws, which is not the case for other regional organizations, even if they try to. Even if some of their members are partly or fully elected by the citizens, they have not lawmaking purposes. And I am highly satisfied as a European citizen to see how the European Parliament has evolved through the years. There's another problem in the source. It doesn't take into account the citizen lawmaking initiative in the European Union, which is a fully standardized. Legislative actions in the European Union are not well represented. Thank you. That was really interesting. Regarding the legislative initiatives that you're talking about, when I was analyzing other organizations, I thought that was impossible, because I saw that they were not included in the founding treaties, but in lesser scope treaties, in many lesser treaties. So I was surprised not to see it in the founding treaties. I'm talking about the legislative initiatives or the the popular legislative initiatives. Even if other types of mechanisms are referenced in the founding treaties, such as the referenda. Yes, I will have to broaden my research. But don't look for references, because as I told you, they're not there. And regarding the Council of Europe, I don't know whether they were not included in the database. I'm sure there are failures or mistakes in the database. But I don't know whether those mechanisms are maybe regulated by lesser treaties, not in the founding treaties. I can assure you that they're not to be found in the founding treaties. But there are many more participatory mechanisms for citizens in all these organizations, and especially in the European Union and in the Council of Europe. But if they are not found in the founding treaties, I have not included them in my study. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you, Professor FREIXES. Ladio?
First, there is a question which in my belief is important. It's a question of,
the micro.
it's a question of terminology. The word regional, particularly in English, it can mean two different things. One can be the regions of France, I don't know, and the other means, organizations that are in a certain region of the world. So I think you should use, for international organizations, you should use the word regional, international, governmental organizations. Because a regional organization can be the European Landowners Association, but this is not governmental. So it's very important to say that we normally refer in English as IGOs, international governmental organizations. I think this is important. By the way, I'm no lawyer, but I think all treaties have exactly the same level. All treaties are agreements between sovereign countries, and all of them, under the Vienna law of treaties, are exactly the same. They are not subsidiary treaties and good treaties or bad treaties. Well, there are good treaties and bad treaties, but all of them have exactly the same level. For instance, I think that part of the problem with analyzing your data, there are two. One of them is you go to the founding treaty. Well, and you see that the Council of Europe, for instance, uses a non-direct election of parliamentarians. But are parliamentarians, which finally are, selected by governments, true representation of citizens? For instance, the Council of Europe, not through a treaty, but through the decision of the Committee of Ministers, which is the government, the main deciding body, we created a conference of NGOs, and we talk about the four dialogue between Committee of Ministers, that means governments, the Parliamentary Assembly, local and regional authorities that were created later, and representing local and regional authorities, and the NGOs conference. So that's one thing I think should be considered, and this is in no treaty. This is simply a very strong development of a wish from the Council of Europe to get really the word of NGOs. Not only that, when you go to the treaties, for instance, the Committee of Ministers decide that all documents of the Council of Europe are public unless those that for some specific reasons are confidential, which are some decisions, and most of them are actually easy to consult by the public, Another thing that I'm not sure is, I didn't know for me the European Union is a regional organization, at least in the common sense of the word. But how have you used the regional organization of the UN? For the UN has the Economic Commission for Europe, and they have, for instance, produced one of the best pieces of legislation for participation. The Aarhus Convention on access to information on the environment and to participation to courts is a beautiful, one of the most significant and pro-NGOs treaties ever. Or, for instance, you take another United Nations organization that it is not regional, United Nations Environment Programme. I come from the environment sector, as you may see. Yeah, but these, for instance, they have regional treaties. They are the regional seas treaties. There is one treaty for the Mediterranean, the Barcelona Convention. There is another treaty for the Baltic. There is another treaty for the... all these have mechanisms of participation by NGOs. And this, so I don't think that the database can give you a first view of things. But then you have to go a little further to see what has happened since the treaty. Because, the Council of Europe was founded in 1949, and the Conference of Local and Regional Authorities came later, the Conference of NGOs came later. Or, for instance, I was running once an environmental convention in which any NGO could just ask 3 months in advance for a meeting to be represented, and they were represented unless 2/3 of the countries opposed, which never happened. So there are treaties within regional organizations that are much more open to public participation, and this is not obvious. This you don't see it in the Council of Europe Treaty. So I think that to evaluate how, in particular NGOs, Parliament is something different, but NGOs can access to the information or to committees. You have to be a little finer. That's my criticism in a work that I think is splendid. But I was not knowing the Council of Europe. Have they considered the Conference of NGOs? Have you considered is non-direct, election of parliaments better? I don't know. There were some things I think that would improve your work if you clarify them, and especially on the nomenclature it would be important. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Eladio.
Thank you very much, Eladio. I also want to advocate for Maria, because before she started the presentation, wanted to change the title. I didn't mention the change in the title. I'm sorry, I rushed to read the title that was printed, but she was anticipating all this.
Like during the whole presentation, I know the limitations of this data set. I'm personally familiar with different mechanisms for citizen participation, both at the global level, at the European level, with the Council of Europe, with the European Union. So I'm also personally active in civil society organizations. And I know about all this. The thing is that, again, they are regulated by lower scope treaties. So meaning they are not the foundational treaty of the organizations. So that's why it's not, it cannot be seen in the data set. And I do acknowledge that this is a real limitation of the research that honestly I don't know well how to overcome. So in case you have some advice also on this, if you know about a data set that perhaps just the Council of Europe has on several characteristics for this, I would really appreciate having this information, because I will continue this research. I'm only in my second year of the PhD, so I really will continue on that. So, of course, yeah, I know, and absolutely. But yeah, there is no way or no mean that at the moment I can use to overcome that. And there is something that I forgot to mention before, that is about this showing whether the elections for parliaments, it's for parliaments that have the capacity to rule or not. And actually that's something that I can do with the information that I have, and that's what I plan to implement with the, in the following steps, because I know whether the parliaments, which kind of functions or competences the parliaments have. And just to come back to the first comment, actually on the denomination, on the regional, international, governmental organizations, I agree, and I think yes, indeed, we should implement that. And I'm thinking further, because actually in my research institute, we have a data set of all the regional organizations in the world, like explaining also the evolution of the different names and membership. And I think we should rethink indeed the way we call them, because way too often we get this critique of whether we are talking about the regional as in local in my region in Murcia, let's say, or if we are talking about regional international level. Thank you.
Gracias, María. Profesora de Codes.
Sí, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, María. Es muy interesante.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's very interesting. Probably the focus is might not be what you say in your conclusion. Studying the citizens' participation mechanisms through the treaties does not give you the key of citizens' participation. And let me speak as an NGO member in Geneva for many years. First in an NGO and then in the member states, Spain. You probably are experienced in that domain, and I've been there for 6 years going to that commission. And the experience I got is that this is a dialogue where NGOs want to make themselves heard by member states, and member states actually negotiate with NGOs. And that's said in a very academic way, because that's the reality. What happens is that citizens' participation is reduced or minimized on a scenario where their voice is not heard. So going back to what Teresa says, where is citizens' participation in the EU? I understand that there is a huge gap of citizens' participation in Europe. Why is that? Because citizens feel very far from that concept of participation and citizenship. We are represented by the politicians, we vote, but we create representation mechanisms, and then we don't go to vote. So this is part of the discussion on what mechanisms are we going to create in the future for citizens' participation. And I'm concerned about this. Going to today's, with the latest elections, people in their 30s and 40s told me they wouldn't go to vote because it's too complicated and there might be gaps in the voting system. The day we can come up with a system where I can use my phone and vote directly by clicking, as you can have your e-signature for any other mechanisms, I might go and vote. It seems that people don't like that electoral setting. That's quite difficult, and maybe with technology we could make it all much more easy. Maybe we will come up with a different way of voting, a reliable way that's simple. You are in the midst of us. You represent a young population that will access citizens' participation mechanisms that are different from what you're studying now. And that's very appealing. Right now, we are in the midst of an evolution process. It's actually a constant evolution. I don't know what you think about, but I would like to hear your opinion. Would you like to reply right now, or shall we move on to the next question? Professor Herbert?
My question is, does it really make sense to compare samples with each other which are actually completely different? You've got on one side the European Union, according to international law, is an entity of its own right, with the right to give itself a constitution. Supranational, as Teresa put it, rather politely. And the other, it's much more than a regional organization by law. And the other organizations are just there for economic cooperation. Yeah. So the question is, I mean, you may compare everything, but the question is, does it make sense? Yeah. That's what struck me actually when I listened. I didn't expect to find the European Union in your samples.
Muchas gracias. Te dejo responder. Hay dos intervenciones más. Si alguien más va...
Yes, I'll let you reply. There are 2 more interventions. If you want to intervene, you have to raise your hand now.
But you are shocked by seeing the European Union there. I mean, I totally get the point that it's a supranational organization, but you know, like when studying regional organizations, so just not only with that data set, but in the work that we do in my research institute, we focus, like regional organizations go until integration. So when there is integration, we still consider them regional organizations. So maybe that's kind of a debate that that I should deep on and research more about. But it's definitely fascinating. So I will for sure do that. But yeah, indeed, I mean, we see the European Union as that example of regional integration that is actually very advanced in the level of integration. But what we can see actually with different indicators that we are developing is that there are also the regional organizations that, okay, of course, they don't have a parliament that they can rule, but they still have other mechanisms that are quite advanced. And it's not only about economic cooperation. Of course, there are so many regional organizations in the world that are only about economic cooperation. But what we can see is that there are also other fields that are in the same organization. So like climate cooperation, human rights cooperation, or so many others. So that's actually something that we are, again, with this set of indicators that we are developing on the structure and the scope of regional organizations, we are looking at that. And I really hope I can offer a wider picture, also comparing more in detail. So maybe the European Union is a standalone example, but then maybe I can compare other regional organizations in the world between themselves because they have like similar competences. But I do understand that this thing on which is really the competence of the different organs or the competences in different cooperation areas, it's interesting to look at. So that's why I mean, it's really the next step, and also I think the logical one. So thank you for that. And regarding the comment on mechanisms for citizen participation, bueno, contesto en castellano que...
Let me reply in Spanish, or... Let me reply in Spanish because I got the question in Spanish. I'm aware that mechanisms, because when we study the treaties, especially with the global approach, you see old-fashioned bodies, and reality is way more advanced. But then you also find other things that are not even regulated in administrative agreements. Those are informal practices that happen, and they also have an impact on the institutions, and those are ways for the civil society to participate. These are mechanisms that somehow can have an impact on the development of the institutions afterwards. I'm aware that that de facto is much richer than what you can find in the treaties. And actually what you find in the treaties is kind of old. But that's what gives you the overall view. I'm aware of the limitation, but I'm also acknowledging that this enables a broader approach. And for the 3rd year of my PhD research, I'm going to do a detailed research on 2 organizations in particular to see whether they have mechanisms involving citizens, a conference on the future of Europe, which is a huge new mechanism, whether they have citizens panels, which mechanisms they have. Things are much more evolved, and I'm happy about that. Thanks, Maria. Camilo, I'm now going to give the floor to the other side because we are also interested in hearing the students' opinion, and then we will hear Camilo and then Professor Moradillos. Well, first of all, congratulations, Maria, for your presentation and also for your brilliant presentation. You're a great speaker. I've heard you before, and you have a great way of expressing yourself. I have 2 questions. related to what Dr. Rosa said before regarding the implementation. In one of the slides, there is the theoretical part saying that the citizen participation improves the implementation of policies. And here is my question. Specifically speaking about implementation, which is quite large, what is improved if we just use a double click? And second question is, does it depend on that in some scenarios citizen participation has more impact in part of those processes, like the example by Dr. Rosa? It's quite enlightening because it is in practice the political game in action. And I want to give you two examples. One, in the case of public policies, in the cycle of public policy making, the civil society has a large impact. They decide the input, and then what sets the output. And here is when there is not so much that we saw this when when we saw the commissions of the truth. The civil society has quite a say, and their participation is not much really, and there are papers with data about that. What do you think is the cause for that? I have an idea, and I will tell you during lunch. Professor Moradillos. Let me start by thanking Maria for her great presentation. Right now, on this side of the table, we feel very proud to be with you on the format of this seminar, because we are learning, we are rethinking things, we transcend and go beyond our own category. So thank you, thanks for everything. But let me do some criticism, not to you, but towards what I believe that it's a trend on that side of the table, and I'm afraid on this side as well. So I will dissent from what many people say, which is also an asset. In a place where everyone thinks the same is a place where many are not thinking. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to try and be a Socratic fly. The core of your presentation, less psychometric core, is the idea, word, and term participation. So let's tackle this in depth. That's a word. That's fortunately a Latin word that can be used in most of the languages around us. Participation, and we have this. So we don't have to discuss this. But that's just as significant. You can say participation, participation. There is a semantic field that calls you from the subject to the transcendental field, which is not a thing because it's not tangible. It is in the middle. And there, the semantic field has to do with something that we'll mention later. And you turn it into a category concept. Participation has no meaning in itself because there is something else, citizen. But if we go back to the original words with a Greek origin that was translated into Latin by pax, that's a conjugated concept. If I tell you, Maria, you are daughter, you are a daughter. In the word daughter, there is another element involved, which is father. Or if I say white, there is immediately another concept saying black. Where there is pax, there is totem. If I break one thing into 3 pieces, then you can rebuild the shape. If I break it into 4,900 pieces, then you wouldn't be able to put it back. Your participation, you're saying is great, that it might be voluntary and active, but it can be forced participation and passive participation. Whether you're participating or not in electoral processes, you will be impacted by the result. And there might be reasons why participation is not wished or negative. And going back to history, but sorry about that, this is what I'm here for. In the classical world, there was a point where Greek participation was mandatory. You could risk your life if you didn't. So it was forced. You were forced to participate. But when the Hellenistic world appeared, participation, far from being a right, something to aspire to, was a condemn. Stoics and Epicureans challenged the idea of participation, such as military participation and contribution, tax participation. There is a motto saying, live hidden, remain quiet, avoid the problems in the public sphere, grow your own garden, your family and your friends. Well, this is the Epicurean and Stoic tradition and Confucian tradition as well. Many parts of Asia follow that. Have you thought that citizen participation might not work because some people do not want, they do not have that will? Can someone not have that will? Yes, thousands of people, and I'm saying this in the student selections. You have a power, you have a say in the university. There are 12,000 students in the University of Extremadura, and 300 voted for their candidate, which takes up 20% of the votes. Again, think about the idea of participation itself. You can reply now. Thanks for your comment. Camilo, I don't know the answer to your question. The way I did my analysis on participation and the way I use the database is by understanding participation in each of the public policy steps. It is true that citizens' participation is present in the part of formulation, maybe also on the agenda setting part. The agenda setting as the framing of the problem, getting to the conclusion of what are the problems we need to respond with public policies. To that part of public policies, the impact is more formal than informal. It is not about formally regulated mechanism and not what we see on the treaties. The part of the treaties focuses on policy making. This is something that, again, I will be able to study over the next month in my next step. Regarding the information regarding the papers and the literature review, I refer to local and regional policies or politics. And they said the citizens know the policies that are happening because they respond to specific interests they showed. And also, citizens take it into practice because they have the resources for that. Probably that part about the resources is giving us the key. But honestly, I'll be delighted to keep on discussing about this. And regarding Professor Moradiello's reflection on participation, I'm fully aware that I have only shown the positive side and the benefits of participation. I can give it a thought. I can include that reflection. I will. My starting point is the approach of active citizenship. And I know that some people do not want to do that. But the way I've always thought about it is that you have to want to be able to and to know how to participate. You know, all three. there is the administration must promote that participation. There's a couple of interventions more, and I want to take the chance that I have the microphone to give you a couple of thoughts I wanted to share with you, especially because this is a part of your thesis and you're going to use it in the future. Have you taken into account the effects, the practical effects of citizen participation? I guess that would be a second part. After analyzing the different ways of participating, the different institutions, different mechanisms, I guess it's quite interesting to analyze the practical effects that it might have in practice, and also how it's perceived by citizens, whether they perceive that their participation has an impact. And that could also be linked to what Professor MARÍA says about not participation or not lack of will to participate. I think Professor FREIXES wants to reflect upon something that was pending, and Professor Codex also wants to intervene. Just one thing. Among the mechanisms, because you're going to go into the EU with your next research, you need to take into account the convention methods. We use it for the Charter of Fundamental Rights, for the project of the European Constitution. It is in the Lisbon Treaty. There is a representation of civil society there. And that is therefore an important mechanism that refers to the amendment of the treaties. Professor de Codex, I would like to remind the students, because you just threw in glove. You have a representation in your universities. You have the opportunity to vote. If we see that the participation of the youth with the young people are not participating in the electoral process of the academia, is because something is wrong and we don't know what to do. We try to find students who want to participate in the elections, and we don't find it. Do you have an answer to that? This is something that needs some research, and it's happening in every school in the world. That's those students who do not want to take part in their own elections. That's very interesting, and there is much to say here. Just to close, thank you very much for all your contributions. Those are topics that I will consider for sure, to give it a thought and to carry on my investigation. It is a privilege to share this space with all of you. Thank you very much to the interpreters. I can't think how horrible the headache is right now.
Bueno, pues creo que hoy nos hemos ganado la comida, por lo menos hasta la comida.
I think we deserve our lunch, and it's time for a break. It's time to feed our bodies after having fed our souls and minds. So let's be back here at 3:15. Please be on time to finish on time. Yes.